everyone. My name is Jillian Sutherland, and I work with an organization called Community Builders located in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And today I'm joined by Jim Charlier with Charlier Associates.
Hello, everybody.
And we are going to talk about the Colorado Downtown Streets book, which is a tool that Community Builders collaborated with Charlier Associates to create for a number of state agencies that we'll talk about in a second, to really serve as the tool for communities, planners, and engineers that are really trying to get the best stuff out of their streets. And so by that we mean, streets that are functional for cars, that add to the economic vibrancy of our communities, that add to the health of our communities, how you can really strike that balance between all of those competing priorities, and particularly how you can work with state DOTs when your main street is also a state highway, which is something that a lot of Colorado communities deal with. And so as I was saying, Community Builders and Charlier Associates worked with a number of state agencies that collaborated to produce this tool for our communities: the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, the Colorado Department of Transportation, and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And these three state agencies really recognized the need for a statewide tool that spoke to how Colorado specifically can address some of these issues. And so today we're going to go through this toolkit. And I want to make mention, you'll see on this slide here, the website where you can access these resources. If you haven't yet downloaded the design manual, I encourage you to do that before we get into this webinar. You could pause it right now and just go and download it, because what we're going to be doing through this webinar is going through the manual and the various aspects of it and how you can make best use of the information within it. And so we'll be giving you page numbers throughout where you can see and get more information about the various topics. Also on DOLA's website, we have a variety of infographics. These are one-page infographics that are, creative ways that you can see some of the top issues that we're going to be discussing. And they can be handy handouts that you can print out and give to elected officials or other partners that you may be working with to help them understand some of the concepts within the book. And along the same lines, we created some fun 1-minute animation videos that explain some of these top issues as well. And so, everybody has 60 seconds of time. And so if you want to just learn about a topic or share a topic in a very quick way, we encourage you to just hit play on those different videos and get some good information. So without further ado, Jim, let's go ahead and dive into the book.
Okay, Jillian, thanks. So again, our focus is very specific. It's what do we do when one of our downtown streets that we care about, that we may be looking at and doing some planning for, is also a state highway. Obviously, there are design questions there, planning and design questions, there are procedural questions, policy questions. So that's the point of this webinar and of the manual that Jillian has been describing. This is targeted at a Colorado audience, but if you're if you're listening in from one of the other Western states, most of this will be readily transferable. And we want you to shift your frame of focus for a second and stop thinking about the street as a traffic artery. And for just a few minutes, think about a street as part of a place, as part of the town. We're going to do that by looking at some slides and asking ourselves, is this great? Is it not great? And why? So Jillian, this is Elkhorn Avenue and Estes Park. What do you think?
Well, I think that this street is not so great. And the reason that I would say that is because, you can see that this is a very highly traveled street. You see a lot of cars and you also see a lot of pedestrians, but you see that the two are very divorced from one another. All of the people are kind of huddled as far away from the cars as they can get. You see the crosswalks aren't well marked, they've been degraded. And as a pedestrian in this environment, I would feel like this wasn't really a street for me.
And to take that sort of concept further, this is First Street in Grand Junction. Clearly, this is not a street for you. This is a street for cars and trucks. Now, to be fair, this is in their downtown, But it is also I-70 the alternative business route for I-70. So it's intended functionally to carry a lot of cars. But we can all see the elements that make it maybe less than an ideal downtown street. The sign clutter, of course, but other things like the sidewalk being relatively narrow right next to the curb, lack of maintenance in the sidewalk, just the sheer volume and speed of traffic and so forth. What do you think about Colorado Boulevard in Idaho Springs?
Well, I do think that this is a great street. And the reason that I say that is because looking at this street, you know, it's very distinctly Idaho Springs. You see these beautiful historic buildings. It's what your eye is drawn to. I think you would feel as a pedestrian walking down this street, you'd feel a nice sense of enclosure from the parked cars there. You wouldn't feel like you were really exposed to traffic. And it just, the character of the street really pops, and it makes you want to explore and see what's going on there.
And to some degree, the reason it's that way is because the street predates the sort of glory days of road building and street widening. This slide is a little bit of unfair example. This is Colorado Boulevard in Telluride. What do you think, Jillian? Great or not great?
Well, I think this is a great street. And what I love about this photo is that the two folks in the picture felt comfortable enough to walk into the street to take this picture. And so what that tells me is that even though they're technically in a space where cars would go, they feel like they can share that space. And so that tells me that the cars that we see a number of cars driving down the street, they must be moving pretty slow for them to feel comfortable enough to do that. And so you see a nice balance between uses. You see bicycles parked on the sidewalk. You see people leisurely looking at events on a sign for what's going on in town. And so this really seems like a nice shared space where everyone feels welcome and it's functional for everybody.
Okay. And another example of this, and you notice that we have a mix of streets that are state highways and streets that are not. This is a street that used to be a state highway. This is Main Street in Breckenridge. Breckenridge and CDOT reached an agreement to swap jurisdiction of Park Avenue and Main Street. So Highway 9 now runs over on Park Avenue along the base of the mountain, and Main Street is now a Breckenridge facility. And they were able to do things with the street, such as the painted lanes you see for bikes on the street. They've done some widening of the sidewalk at some locations. You see the new trees, the pedestrian scale lighting. So in a lot of ways, this street feels like a main street. So this is Main Street in Delta, Jillian, and they've been through some challenges with this, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is still a state highway, and I know that they have been trying to slow down traffic and bring some economic vitality into their downtown, and I think they've done some great things in order to make strides that way. But even so, when you look at this street, you know, what you see is a whole lot of pavement and not a ton of space designated for pedestrian activity. And so I would suspect that the cars that are on this street are moving rather fast. And so that can create a noisy environment for pedestrians. So I think that this has a lot of potential, but probably has some things that could be improved upon.
Yeah, and there's a lot that's good about this. I mean, the scale of the buildings along the street, the articulation of the storefronts, not bad, you know, and if you were going to have a 4-lane street plus left turn accommodation in your downtown, this would be certainly the kind of design you might look for. By contrast, this is Lincoln Avenue in Steamboat Springs. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, this, you know, this is kind of a more extreme example of that vast pavement, right? So, you know, as a pedestrian looking to cross this street, I would be very nervous. There seems to be traffic that could be moving pretty quickly down this street. There are a lot of curb cuts that you see by the gas station. So I would be worried a lot as a pedestrian about unpredictable car movement, and it would make me feel not so safe and not wanting to walk around and browse. I mean, it's interesting how just some of those cues can make walking even a half a block feel a lot farther and would discourage you from walking rather than just hopping in your car and driving where you need to go to your next destination.
And this is a lot about opportunity. I mean, the downtown Steamboat is actually a pretty cool place in spite of the street. The city has studied over the years at least a couple of times the potential for doing bypasses, but it looks like this is going to be US 40 probably from now on. And so this is probably a slide about opportunity. Where are the opportunities? And that's what we'll be talking about from now on. So the book starts with a conversation about the benefits of great streets. So if you flip to pages 8 and 9, you'll see the start of that conversation. We sort of start out with the business end of things and business and economic development, right, Jillian?
Yeah, that's right. Economic development, of course, is something that is at the forefront of all communities. It's one of those issues that everybody's trying to get right. And streets are one of the greatest ways that you can accomplish some of your economic development goals. It's one of our largest public spaces that we have in our communities. They take up so much of our space and so much of our public dollars and investment. And so we really want to look at ways that we can leverage that to accomplish our community goals. And there are a lot of ways that we can do that. You know, the way that the street is designed really can enhance your business's vitality. And just a quick example that I will use is in Glenwood Springs, where Community Builders is headquartered. So 7th Street in Glenwood Springs, it's not a state highway, but it is a popular street, and it's where a lot of our restaurants are located. And the sidewalk was too narrow to have outdoor dining. And so there was a lot of community conversation about whether or not we should sacrifice some parking spaces along 7th Street in order to accomplish outdoor dining. And of course, storefront parking is important, but in this instance, the community decided to make that trade-off and do the outdoor dining. There's still some parking readily available nearby, but what they were able to see was a 10% increase in sales tax just from that tweak, from that public investment. And so just really thinking about the goals of your street and how you can balance the goals and accomplish what you want in your community and your downtown environment.
Okay, and a related point is that you know, most towns and cities are interested in encouraging redevelopment of older buildings, maybe infill development where they may have some gap teeth in the building wall along the street. When you invest in a street and make it a nicer street, that public investment often will lead to private sector response and private sector investment. Safety is obviously a major function of street design and planning. Sometimes I think we have gotten away from being strategic about that and being determined. And so in the manual, we emphasize this a little bit. We'll talk more about it in a few slides. Jillian, I know that you've thought a lot about accessibility and what that means in the downtown.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, a lot of people, most people in their lifetimes will experience some sort of limited mobility. And it's really important that we design our streets so that they are accessible to people of all abilities. So a rule of thumb that we talk about a lot is, will this street be comfortable and safe for an 8-year-old all the way to an 80-year-old? Would they be able to cross the street? Would they be able to access the businesses safely? Of course, storefront parking is a big part of that too. So we're not just talking about access for people, but also access to the businesses and the amenities that are along the street.
Okay, and again, we'll get into design details of that. Certainly you want, you know, your downtown to feel like a green place. We tend to think about ecology in the context of rural places, but it's very important in our cities as well. So street trees, being strategic about shading and so forth. And public health is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in Colorado, you know, we are kind of touted for being one of the healthiest states in the nation, which is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're super healthy. So in Colorado, nearly 6 in 10 adults are either overweight or obese, which is a big problem. And what studies show is that if you live in a place where there are sidewalks readily available to you, you are a lot more likely to get your 30 minutes of recommended daily activity. And so providing sidewalks, providing safe places to bike are critical to the public health of our communities.
And to be specific, the point we're making here is that when you invest in the street, you should have objectives, things you're trying to achieve. One of those could be an improvement in public health. Research shows that when people are able to be active as part of their daily routines, perhaps walking when they could have driven, or perhaps biking and so forth, that you actually see a measurable improvement in public health. So on that subject of what are we trying to accomplish, we like to pose the question this way, and you would think this would be the way we would go about it, but often it's not. So the question when we're looking at planning design is, what do we want from this street? What are we trying to accomplish? And we've talked about quite a long list there. There's a number of things we might want to accomplish, all the way from economic goals to safety and accessibility to environmental and public health goals, all of which are important public policy issues. But what we often see is that those are sort of ruled out because we have this other goal that's more important, which is traffic flow and having unimpeded, uncongested flow of traffic in a downtown. Most of the people watching this webinar will know that that's probably not actually the most important goal for downtown street, but it is an objective and it belongs in the list somewhere. Now, maybe it's not the least important, maybe it's in between, right below safety, or maybe because of the unique circumstance locally, it's the most important, almost the most important thing. That can vary, and that's okay. So traffic flow is an objective, but it's one of a list of objectives, not the only objective. And so we're going to sort of toggle to design, and we want to change our reference a little bit and start thinking about infrastructure. And so Jillian, here's a question for you. This is a street that was planned and designed in West Oahu. This is one of our few non-Colorado photos, to be a business street, to be kind of a downtown street. Do you think the street could become this street, which is obviously Main Street in Louisville, Colorado?
It would be quite a feat in order for it to become something like this. And the reason that I say that is because you see such large public investments that have been made, probably not in the wisest fashion. So the way that the utility poles were built, where they were placed on the sidewalk, the width of the sidewalk, the width of the actual street, probably if that was what they were aiming for, they should have made some different choices from a design perspective in order to make something like this happen.
And in Louisville, you see just about everything is just right? So all of the kind of memorize this image, and we'll come back to Louisville a couple of times, but this is a street that's been staged for success. So design matters. And we'll pivot now to the pages 10 through 11 in our manual, where we start getting into the nitty-gritty of design. And in the interest of time, we're not going to drill down on all of those. We encourage you to take the time to look through all those pages and think about the issues that might be most appropriate in your community. But we'll talk about a couple of things that we think will help frame a local, thinking about a local street. The first of which is context, which is a really, really important idea in transportation. When I was coming up as a transportation planner, we were taught that streets should be designed based on their functional classification. Every planner in the room just groaned because, well, everybody hates the concept of functional classification. But the underlying idea was that once you knew the street was a collector or a major arterial, minor arterial, whatever it was, you just kind of went to the book and you found that page, and that's what the design should be. Actually, that's not good strategic design. Streets need to reflect their function, but they also absolutely, especially in cities and in downtowns, cities and towns and downtowns, they need to reflect the land use context that they're passing through. And to make this point, we're going to look at US 287, major important US highway, goes through a number of states, goes all the way north-south across Colorado, and goes through Longmont. Nice little city in the Front Range, about 90,000 people. And as it comes through town, it transitions from a rural context to what we were calling in the manual a transition context, to a downtown context, and then back to transition back out to rural. And the facility type is adjusts to those different contexts. It starts out as a highway, it becomes a street, a transitional street, it becomes a main street. US 287 is Main Street of Longmont. Then it transitions out to the suburban area as a street and then becomes a rural highway again. And so you can see this in the images from Google Maps. This is US 287 south of Longmont. We're headed north here. It's a rural highway, paved shoulders, 5 lanes. A little bit of a question you could ask about why do we have a 5-lane highway where we don't have a lot of driveways, but obviously a very wide high-speed facility. As we come into town, it starts to pick up a little more of the character of the abutting businesses, which in this case are car-oriented retail. So you see a sidewalk now, you don't see on-street parking, you still have a 5-lane street. In this case, we need that 5th lane for left turns. But then you come into the downtown and it's a very different street. Here we have wider sidewalks. We have same lane capacity. We have a 4-lane facility with left turn accommodation at the intersections, but we have on-street parking. It's obviously a much lower speed environment. And what we see is that we have now shifted our emphasis from moving traffic to providing a pedestrian walk environment, which has been done very skillfully in downtown Longmont. And so Main Street in Longmont is a place that's highly walkable. We're going to talk about elements of the sidewalk later, but anybody looking at this slide can tell that the businesses are healthy. The street is lovely, and this is a nice element of downtown Longmont. Then as we move north, we move back into that more suburban context. Pedestrian accommodation, not always the best, maybe no on-street parking, 5-lane road. And then we get back out in the country, and we have that same cross-section we saw south of town, the 5-lane undivided with paved shoulders. So context and design go hand in hand. Another major core design principle that we want to emphasize as you use this manual is safety. We tell each other, everybody talks about safety, but nobody does anything about it. And it is important to be deliberate and strategic and determined to improve the safety of our streets. The interesting thing is that we actually have data that we can use, and it's useful and important. Anybody can do this. Any planner or designer, engineer, landscape architect, whatever, on this call or in this webinar can obtain this data and use it. Crashes are classified as property damage, which are fender bender crashes, personal injuries where somebody got hurt, and fatalities. And that's, so we call that crash severity. It's a transition from a minor accident, minor crashes to major crashes. And we've started using close calls data that we gather by having citizens interact with the map and indicate where in their downtown they've had close calls. And we found that close calls are good predictors of crashes. Property damage crashes are good predictors of where you might have personal injuries, especially as speeds increase, and then personal injuries are predictors of potential fatalities. So paying attention to crash severity is a useful thing to do. So Jillian, here's an interesting question. This street is, you can see the design of it and the sign says 45. What if we wanted to lower speeds and we put a speed limit sign for 25 miles per hour out here?
Well, I think that if we change the speed limit to 25 miles per hour but left the street as is, it wouldn't be very effective. So you would have, you know, some sticklers who are going to obey the speed limit, which is, you know, good. And so you'd have some people going 25, but probably the majority of drivers would continue to be driving at 45 miles per hour. And the reason is because the way that the street is designed with these very wide lanes, and it just looks, you know, like a street that's made to drive fast. And so you'd have this sort of differential of some people going 25 and some people going 45, and that's really unsafe. That creates a really unsafe environment.
And we go into more detail on that question of how to set speed limits in the manual. But the basic point that you've been making, Jillian, is that the design if we want traffic to be slower on this street, we have to change the design of the street. We simply can't legislate a lower speed. And that becomes really important for pedestrians, which are a key indicator species of a healthy downtown. And pedestrians have a pretty good intuitive sense of risk. They look at a street like this with high-speed traffic, very wide, long way across, and they sense a lot of risk, and that's accurate. First of all, our streets are becoming riskier. Our traffic fatalities that are pedestrians have been increasing in raw numbers and as a percentage of the total in Colorado. And so a lot of the problem with pedestrian fatalities has to do with the speed of traffic. This is a somewhat grim graphic that shows that the probability of surviving a crash based on the speed of the moving vehicle. At 20 miles per hour, we have a 95% chance of surviving, but at 40 miles per hour, only a 15% chance of surviving. So that's pretty grim. And when you think about how many main streets or major downtown streets in Colorado have traffic that's flowing at 35, 40, 45 miles per hour, you understand the seriousness of speed if we want to have a pedestrian environment. The good news is crash data is available. You can work with Colorado DOT through your regional safety engineer in your regional office. You can obtain this data. It usually takes 2 or 3 days to get, but it's useful and interesting. Here's data for Gunnison from an assistance project that community builders did for the city of Gunnison, Colorado. And it shows some of the crash data has been organized and mapped for people to look at and think about. And it shows there are some ahas in here. Now, obviously the intersection of 135, which is our main street, and State Highway 50, which is this street here, that's going to be a major crash location simply because of the amount of traffic that's there. But you notice this sort of anomaly up here, and when we start seeing broadsides, we realize that we're getting left turn crashes. And we realize we have a shopping center here. And so the city is now saying, oh yeah, and the DOT together are saying we may have to think about how this is working and how we can make this safer. So you do have the data, it is available, and you should use it. Moving to function, Jillian.
Yeah, so in thinking about the function of the street, we have a lot of competing entities that we need to balance and deal with. And so that's design, which we've been talking about. It includes traveler safety that Jim just touched on. And then also, what is the capacity of the street? And so where all of these things intersect is where you want to be investing your money. And that's what this graphic represents. But so often what we do instead is that we favor function and capacity of the street over the design and over safety. And so we really are putting our money on making it better for traffic flow. And that is incredibly expensive. And it also forces you to make these really huge trade-offs. And you don't necessarily need to do that entirely. You need to find the balance between all three.
And this is something where planners and engineers who work for cities and counties and local citizens and elected officials, this is something where you can play a major role, because that appropriate sense of balance is going to be a little bit different in every community. And so having you at the table actually helps Colorado DOT a lot when they're making design decisions. And you can start looking at issues of, here's what we want our downtown to be, here's some things we want the street to accomplish for us. And the more sense you make on that, the more effective you'll be at bringing this back to the kind of balance that Jillian is talking about. Here's a street where that balance perhaps got away from us a little bit. I won't name it or the community, but as you can see, this is traffic capacity is the only objective in this graphic, in this image. Walk environment, not so much. Storefront businesses, probably not. On-street parking, nope. When you hear the traffic experts, engineers, and so forth talking about congestion and traffic volume, they'll use a term level of service, LOS, and that's a measure of the volume to capacity ratio. If you have a street that can handle 16,000 vehicles per day, but you have 20,000 vehicles per day going through the street, it will have a lower level of service. And that the system we've been using is kind of simplistic, and it's intended to be a communication tool. Unfortunately, it's had some somewhat bad effects in terms of the logic that it uses and the impression it creates. And the impression it creates is that level of service A is good and level of service F is bad. And of course, that's not that simple. Level of service A means you're almost the only car on the street, and you can turn wherever you want to, you can switch lanes, there's no traffic. And I think most people who care about their downtown would not characterize that as being a good downtown or successful downtown. And so there's some kind of balance in there. And the graphic actually looks more like this. When you're off to the left and you have a huge street with hardly any cars on it, that's not optimal for a downtown. It's actually not optimal in terms of highway investment. On the other hand, when you're way over on the right and you've got a congested street, it may be you still have a pretty healthy downtown, and many downtown streets are congested. But the community and the people in the community have more objectives than just a healthy downtown. And some people just want to be able to get to work, and some people don't want to sit in traffic. And so the practical matter is there's some sort of an optimal range in here that we think is somewhere around level of service D, and I think that's the consensus of the engineering community today. So you're not looking for this, you're looking for something that's more like this when you deal with LOS, and that's as technical as we're going to get on that subject today. And Julian, intended users, you were commenting on this a little bit earlier, that's a major part of planning and design as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be thinking about who the street is for and who it's to be serving. And in our downtown environments, that of course, we've been saying this a lot, it's not just cars. You need to be servicing pedestrians, which you see in this photo. You need to be servicing bicyclists. Can be a significant part of your community. Of course, this is Fort Collins, where you've got a lot of students, and it's a huge biking community. So those need to be balanced in the design of the street, which it is here. Another thing to consider, of course, is bus service, which is something that should be becoming more and more prevalent as we have aging population. A lot of people have mobility challenges or simply don't want to drive. And so that's something else that we need to be thinking about, especially in our downtowns and on some of our major streets which may be bus routes. How are you going to accommodate that in the design of your street?
And most of you listening to this have had some experience thinking about meeting the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The shorthand we use is meeting ADA requirements. And that is important, and certainly a lot of places in Colorado we haven't quite achieved that yet. But the manual actually provides a little bit broader frame, which using this term universal access. And the point that's being made is that there are many reasons why we might have some physical challenges as we move around in our communities, including we have a couple of kids in strollers, or we're carrying some groceries, or we're towing a grocery cart, or we're walking a bike, or we have our luggage with us, or in addition to the actual physical disabilities. And the term that sort of embraces this sense of everybody being able to use the street is universal access, and it's a key design principle. The ADA requirements are a very good starting point for that, and they're readily available, and you should all be familiar with them. But realize that it's not some sort of grudging meeting the regulatory requirements for accommodating people with disabilities. What you're investing in when you make these improvements is you're investing in a downtown that works better for everybody. And then finally, I know Community Builders has thought a lot about place making and how that interacts with streets.
Yeah, absolutely. So placemaking is really a concept for how can a community, through the design of their street, through the design of their public spaces, really say something unique about their community? How do you really make it a place that pops for people? People really feel like they belong there. They feel like they're in a special place. And you can see that really well. This is Main Street in Louisville. This is not a state highway, but it's just such a wonderful example of how you make a street a real place for people. So you see a lot of space allocated for outdoor dining. You see a really great walkway for people to be able to kind of stroll down the street. You see really cool historic signs. I mean, if you were driving down the street, you would really want to park and check out what was going on here. And so that's what we're talking about placemaking. And, you know, this is Longmont, again, their main street, and this is a state highway. And so you may, you know, because of traffic volumes, you may not have all of the opportunities that you saw in Louisville, but you do have plenty of opportunities still. And so you see Longmont did a great job of creating, you know, planting beautiful street trees. They still maintain that really great building wall, good space for walking. You still have enclosure from the cars. And so this is a good downtown where you would want to spend time, and you'd probably remember for a really long time the pleasant experience you had in downtown Longmont.
And a couple of points about that. The business environment in downtown Longmont is very healthy, and there are great restaurants. There are cool stores. There are 2 guitar stores on 1 block. That's kind of my standard. And the next time somebody says, well, you can't have on-street parking because it's a state highway, you can just show them this photo here. So from here, we're going to drill down in the final section of this on a little bit more technical on the elements of the street. And the manual is organized around these 6 elements, which are horizontally shown in these images here, and we'll just go through them quickly. The first is the travel way, which is where the moving vehicles are. It's not where the vehicles are parked, it's the part of the street where we're talking about traffic volume and capacity and so forth. And the manual talks about the travel lanes and their width and design, the turn lanes, raised medians, all of that kind of stuff. We'll just show you a little bit on a couple of those topics, travel lanes and raised medians. The key point here is that travel lanes should be no wider than necessary. This is actually in the AASHTO Green Book, has been since it was first written. Again, if you think back to the slide where we were showing there's like this optimum curve, it's not a straight line, it's an optimum, you're trying to optimize. 12-foot lanes are not necessarily optimal. So, and then, so you can argue for narrower lanes. And you know, Colorado DOT has many main streets that are on the state highway in Colorado, on the state highway system in Colorado that have 11-foot widths and even some 10-foot widths. And if you know your design manuals, you know that there are circumstances where you might even, heaven forbid, go down to 9 feet. So if somebody says it's a state highway, the lane has to be 12 feet wide, not true. And then medians are another element that can make a big difference. We wouldn't always think of having a median in a downtown, but where we have a multi-lane street that's really wide, and we want to slow the cars down, we want to beautify the downtown, and we want to encourage pedestrians to cross, a median can be a good solution. And so that's the solution they've been using in Longmont. This is an image actually from Hawaii, but I want to make a point here. This Kailua Road was this sort of out of control, nasty looking, overbuilt arterial, and the city came in and installed these medians. And you know, the good news in Hawaii is these monkey pod trees grow very fast. This thing's only been here about 15, 20 years, but it has changed the character of Kailua Road in Kailua, which is on the windward coast of Oahu, very profoundly. And so sometimes a median can be the right answer. It's on a 2-lane street, maybe not the first thing you'd look at, but on a multi-lane street, it may have a role to play. And then moving from there to the travel edge, and Jillian, you were commenting on this earlier, and we were highlighting here a couple of specific elements of the travelway edge, parking and curb extensions.
Yeah, that's right. And so in the manual, you can get specific design recommendations for all of the things that we're talking about. But we're going to touch on, yeah, two key things for the travelway edge, and that's on-street parking and also curb extensions. So we've been saying this a couple times so far in this webinar, that storefront parking supports storefront businesses. It's really important. You know, people need to have fairly convenient access to businesses. And, cars are an important part of that, as is walking. And so, could you go back, Jim?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is actually a photo from Grand Avenue in Laramie, and I do want to make mention that that's not a state highway. We see diagonally parked vehicles here, which is not something you would typically see on a state highway. But again, it just makes the point that that's really vital for the success of your downtown businesses. So moving forward, curb extensions are also something that happens along the travelway edge that is really critical in your downtown environment. Oftentimes when you start to see curb extensions, that's one of the first things that signals to people who are in cars that this is not just a street for them. There are going to be pedestrians present. And the reason is because curb extensions extend where the pedestrian is placed on the street, and it shortens their crossing distance, and it brings them more noticeable to drivers or bicyclists that are on the street. And a rule of thumb for when you are designing curb extensions is to make sure that they extend the entire length of your on-street parking. Some communities get a little shy about their curb extensions and they just do a little one that doesn't extend all the way. And that's not a great use of space because you can't park a car there anyways. And it also allows people to turn corners a lot more quickly. And so traffic may be moving more quickly when they're making turns, which makes pedestrians not feel safe. And so this is kind of the best practice in design shown here.
And you'll hear often that we can't have a curb extension here because we need a big turning radius for trucks. And it's useful to actually push back on that a little bit and actually get into the details and see if that's really true. For example, on this street where we have a bike lane, that changes that turn radius. So the effective turn radius now is not this line here, it's this line here, which has a much larger radius. So, and then we're going to combine the next three elements into one because they are the part of the street that we typically call the sidewalk. So the furnishing zone, the pedestrian throughway, and the frontage zone. So oftentimes when Jillian and I are working on a project, we'll have somebody come up to us from the public and say, well, how wide should our sidewalks be? And we actually think that's not where you start. We think you start with what is the design of a good sidewalk, what does it look like, and how do you allocate the space? And so this graphic shows that. This is from the manual, and it shows that we actually have three zones. We have a furnishing zone, which is where you might put street trees, you might have benches, you might have newspaper box, if anybody still has those. This is where you put your sign standards, not in the pedestrian throughway. So your poles don't go here, they go here. And then we have the pedestrian throughway, which is intended to be barrier free. Now this is, you obviously want this to be wide enough to make it a social sidewalk so that people can pass other people and a couple can walk holding hands and so forth. But you may or may not always be able to have the width here that you want. And then the first furnishing zone is something that sort of ties the building to the sidewalk. And this is where you can have storefront displays. You might have sidewalk seating. You might have just, as we'll see in a photo in a second, you might just have a little plant in a pot. So this is an example of a street. This is a very nice street, obviously, in Boulder. This is East Pearl. It's not, as it turns out, an expensive street, but it does have all of those elements in the right place. This is the furnishing strip, the pedestrian throughway zone, the frontage zone, which allows the buildings and the businesses to have a little bit of personality as they interact with the street. It's very important. This is Grand Avenue. Jillian showed you a slide from here a little while back. This is a very nice street in Laramie. We have these Laramie photos in here because we did an assistance project for Laramie recently. But again, you see the components in the same place. The furnishing strip where the poles go, the walking area where the pedestrians go, and then this frontage zone along the fronts of the businesses, which in this street are being used for seating, which is a perfectly valid use of that space. Here's a street that maybe doesn't do that. This is the street we were actually up there helping them with, which is 3rd Street, runs north-south. It's Highway 287, same highway we saw down in Longmont. Big difference, obviously. And here we have a blank wall, we have a sidewalk where the furnishings are in the wrong place and so forth. Sidewalks like this feel a little bit like this. And they're not comfortable, they don't encourage walking. And we, to paraphrase Yogi Berra, if the people don't want to come out and walk, you can't stop them. So the pedestrian walking is a choice activity, and if it's not a very walkable environment, people won't walk, they'll drive. Here's on that point of width. This is the street we looked at a while ago in Idaho Springs, Colorado. It's actually a pretty nice street, as we saw, but notice the sidewalk's not terribly wide. The space allocation they got the space allocation right. They've got a little bit of frontage zone, they've got some furnishings over here, and they've got the barrier-free walk zone. It's not very wide. And no doubt the city would love to maybe have another 5 feet of sidewalk width here, but they're getting by. It's a historic street, and it is what it is, and it's a nice place. So space allocation often is more important than sidewalk width itself. And then finally, looking at the buildings are part of the street, and how the buildings address the street and how they frame the street is a very important consideration in design. And this is where planners, local planners, this is where you need to step to the table and say, wait a second, this is what we want, this is how this should be. The way you write your development requirements, the way you write your zoning and subdivision requirements can influence this. When you get it right, it can look like this, a photo taken very early in the morning on Main Street, Highway 135 in Gunnison, but a nice street that has inherited some nice buildings. And that street wall, highly articulated, small buildings, lots of glass, that is a pedestrian-oriented environment. You see the arcade over here where there's a little bit of shade. And you can see that in the past they have widened the sidewalk. What else do we notice here, Jillian?
Well, you can see that they actually didn't move the storm drains when they did that. And so oftentimes when you're extending the sidewalk, it can be very expensive because you need to replace a lot of those utilities and you need to move them. And they found a workaround to that. So they were able to accomplish their goals while probably saving some dollars.
So this is where an example of where maybe the off-the-shelf design was not acceptable, and the city pushed back a little bit and said, wait a second, we really do need wider sidewalks. And if you don't have money for the relocating the stormwater utilities, then we need to think about another design solution. The importance of that is really dramatized here. This is not the blank wall. The difference between a nicely articulated set of storefronts and a blank wall is pretty dramatic. And that can take a lot of different forms. Elk Avenue and Crescent Butte, these small Victorian buildings, West Pearl and Boulder with the sort of complex, messy street, very encouraging to pedestrians. So the buildings matter too. And then we have a couple more chapters.
Yeah, and we're not going to go into great detail about these chapters because we don't have the time, but we want to make you aware of the resources available within the rest of the book. So chapter 3, once you're moving from all the design details that Jim and I have been talking about, and there are a lot more details in the book that I want to just make that note to everybody. We move into chapter 3, which talks about how you create great streets. And so it's really a problem-solving chapter, and it helps you diagnose what is really going on with your street. So an example would be, we want more pedestrian activity on our street. And so it guides you through some questions. Why don't you have that going on right now? And once you answer those questions, what are some of the design elements you could look at in order to help you accomplish your goal? And one of the case studies we talk about in there is Rifle. It's a great case study, and we try to bring some stories from Colorado communities to life so that you can see how some other communities have addressed these issues. And the communities that we talk about vary in size as well. We tried to focus on some smaller communities too, because everybody can do this stuff. There are ways to get it done. So chapter 4 is all about implementation, speaking of getting stuff done. And this has a couple of different sections within the chapter. we begin with talking about how you can work and partner with the Colorado DOT, how you can understand the way that they do business, and how you as a community can time it right to work well with them, particularly when they're going to come and do a project on your main street that is also a state highway. How do you effectively partner in and accomplish mutual goals? We have a couple of case studies that highlight how you do that. Both Kremling and Ridgway are really excellent examples that I encourage you to look up. Also in this chapter, we have a section about quick win projects. And so these are projects that they go by many names. You may have heard terms like tactical urbanism or lighter, quicker, cheaper projects. Really what they are cheap ways of implementing some solutions. So transportation projects can often be very expensive, and there are a lot of ways that you can test things out or even do permanent improvements that don't cost a lot of money. And so we wanted to provide a resource to communities that tells you how you can do that. And we have a couple of case study examples for that as well. And then we conclude the book talking about funding resources. And so what that talks about is not only some federal sources, from some statewide sources, which have some variability to them. And so what we really emphasize in the funding section are local sources. What are some ways that you as a community can ensure that you have dollars in order to accomplish some of your infrastructure goals? And that is really important, especially when you're partnering with a state agency to get a project done, or you're trying to get grant funding. Match dollars are critically important. And so we talk about some of the ways that you as a community can make that happen for yourself. So to conclude, I just want to say one more time, this book in its entirety is available for free. And I encourage everyone to download it at DOLA's website. You can also just Google Colorado Downtown Streets, and I think that you'll be able to find the link to this. But that's just the direct link that will take you to the tool, and also those handouts that I talked about and the videos. And so I just want to, one more time, mention the state agencies that were really forward thinking in developing this resource: the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, Colorado Department of Transportation, and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, really recognizing how important this is to the success of our communities. And so thank you, Jim, as well, for joining the webinar today.
Thank you, Jillian.
Yeah, and we wish everybody the best of luck, and make use of these resources, and good luck on creating wonderful streets in your downtown.